Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about life inside the medieval castle. Not the one sung by bards or painted in noble tapestries, but the one I remember, damp, restless, and far from royal. Close your eyes, if you will, and let your mind drift back with me. Back to a time when the world was simpler, yet far more perilous. When a man's word was his bond, and steel sang its deadly song under the morning sun. But before we begin, tell me, fellow wanderer, from what distant land do you listen? And what time does your clock strike as my account reaches you? It brings me comfort to know when and where my voice is heard. I remember the cold most of all, the kind that crept into your bones and never quite left. A castle's stone walls were thick and unyielding, built for defense, not for warmth. In the depths of winter, they drank the chill from the air and held it close like a jealous lover. Fires, even grand hearths, did little but flicker in defiance. The cold seeped through the floors, the ceilings, the very breath we exhaled at dawn. When the sun rose, it brought no comfort. The summer months brought their own misery, trapped heat like a furnace, building within the chambers. With few windows and poor ventilation, the air grew thick, stale, and stifling. I recall lying awake under heavy furs, not for warmth, but because sleep would not come. Sweat clung to my skin as thick as the dust in the corners of the stone room. The walls echoed, but they gave no mercy. In the chapel, in the corridors, in the great hall, the stone was always present, unmoved and unmoving. Moisture gathered on its surface during damp seasons, growing moss and mildew. We wiped it away as best we could, but it always returned. The air was damp, and so were our cloaks, our boots, even our bones in time. The castle breathed, not with warmth, but with a chill that clutched at the living. Tapestries were hung not for beauty alone, but to keep the cold at bay. Heavy wool draped over the walls in noble chambers, but the wind still found its way through the arrow slits and unshuttered gaps. We stuffed rushes and straw in the cracks when winter came, praying the wolves outside didn't howl too near. But nothing, not even the thickest fur or most faithful hound, could truly shield us from the stone's silence. Beds were no sanctuary. The sheets, if there were any, were cold to the touch, and mattresses stuffed with straw or feathers rarely kept the frost from biting. I've seen nobles rise shivering, their breath fogging the air in their own chambers. Servants, huddled on pallets by the kitchens or stables, fared far worse. We all shared the same air, the same stone, and the same aching cold. Rank meant little to the walls. At dawn, before the hearth was rekindled, the castle felt like a crypt. We wrapped our hands in cloth before touching iron handles. The floors froze over on harsh nights, and more than once I slipped while rushing to dress for duty. There was no luxury in such mornings, only the routine of discomfort, accepted without complaint. Such was the way of things. You endured, or you did not. In rare moments of sunlight, a shaft of warmth might spill through a high window. It was then the dogs would seek it first, curling on the stone in quiet reverence. I often joined them in spirit, if not in body, standing near the light as if it might purify the chill within. But the moment was fleeting. The sun moved on, and the cold returned, not angry, but inevitable. To live in a castle was not to live in splendor, but to live in vigilance. Against attack, yes, but also against the cold, a silent enemy that never truly left. We wore our cloaks indoors and kept our boots close to the fire, yet we were never quite warm. And still we endured, because that was what life in stone demanded. Not comfort, but strength. Not ease, but patience. The first thing one noticed upon entering a castle was not its grandeur, but its scent, a heavy, lingering odour that clung to every hall and stairwell. It was the smell of life, lived in close quarters and little sanitation. Sweat, smoke, waste, and old food woven into the very stones. No perfumed reed nor pot of herbs could fully mask it. The stench was as much a part of the castle as its battlements. Smoke, always smoke, from hearths, kitchens, and torches, rolled through the corridors like a ghost that refused to leave. It blackened the rafters and settled into our garments, even into our hair. On winter days, when every fire was lit, the air itself grew thick, and breathing deep brought the taste of soot to the tongue. Our eyes stung, and yet we carried on, for fire was life, and the smoke its price. Then came the scent of humanity. Bathing was rare, and a man who sweated in mail or worked in the kitchens bore his scent like a second skin. The noble halls were no exception. Velvet and brocade could not hold back the aroma of unwashed bodies. Ladies daubed themselves with rosewater and men with oils, but beneath it all, the truth remained. We all reeked in our own way. Chamber pots, emptied not nearly often enough, added their notes to the composition. In quiet corners, under stairwells, behind tapestries, the smell of stale urine and worse would linger. Some castles had garderobes, those curious shafts built into the outer walls, but the wind was not always strong enough to carry the waste far from the walls. And so it lingered, especially in summer. In the kitchens, the aromas were more familiar, yet no less overwhelming. Boiling meat, tallow, old fat, and scorched grain mixed with the constant heat. Rats and mice scurried where scraps fell, and their droppings added yet another layer to the scent. The cold larders were no sanctuary. Even preserved food, when past its time, released sour whispers into the air. I recall the halls before a feast, the scent of roasting flesh, of onions and spices, mixing with dogs panting and servants sweating under heavy platters. But once the feast was done, the remains festered. Bones, grease and spilled ale soaked into rushes on the floor. The cleaning was swift but never thorough, and the stone remembered it all. Days later, one could still smell the echoes of indulgence. Even the sacred places were not spared. Chapels, though reverent in spirit, bore the scent of incense thickened with mildew and the damp of stone. Candles burned low, and old garments stored nearby added the musk of age. Kneeling in prayer, one breathed in holiness mingled with the human, and neither was pure. And so the castle smelled, not of royalty or romance, but of life as it truly was. Raw, crowded, and unrelenting. It taught me early that a man's nose must learn to forgive, or he would find no peace behind castle walls. The air did not judge, and neither did we. We simply breathed, because there was no other choice. Of all the tasks I came to loathe, none tested my dignity more than answering nature's call within castle walls. There were no porcelain thrones, no running water, no gentle privacy as one might dream today. Instead, we had chamber pots, crude bowls of metal or clay, tucked beneath beds or behind curtains, used by high and low alike. In the night, when cold winds howled and torches burned low, we reached for them without ceremony. Come morning, the stench was unmistakable. It was the servant's burden to carry these pots, sloshing and foul, down narrow stairs to be emptied into pits, or worse, into the moat below. The same moat from which children sometimes drew water, unaware of the danger. I saw good men fall ill from that water, struck down not by sword, but by what could not be seen. The rot beneath our feet was constant and rarely spoken of. Garderobes, those vertical shafts built into the stone, were hailed as improvement, but they offered little comfort. One sat high above the earth, a wooden seat set over an open chute, with the breeze slipping in to chill one's skin and the fumes rising to meet the nose. Some opened directly over the outer wall, others into cesspits that had to be shoveled when full. When I close my eyes, I can still hear the buzzing of flies that lingered near those shafts. In some keeps, multiple guardrabes lined a wall, allowing several to sit at once. Modesty was a lesser concern than necessity. Curtains offered the only semblance of privacy, and even then, conversation might continue uninterrupted. I remember sitting beside a lord once, each of us feigning indifference as we tended to our business. There was no shame in it, only inevitability. The task of cleaning these spaces fell to the lowest among us, often young boys or the infirm. They carried pails, scrub brushes, and rags soaked in vinegar or lye. Their hands bore the scars of their duty, and their noses learned not to protest. I recall the face of one such boy, hollow-eyed, always hunched, but never complaining. His job was to clean what others could not bear to see. Disease found a welcome home in such conditions. Flies and rodents feasted on waste and spread filth with every step. Dysentery was common, and when it came, it spread fast. Doctors knew little, and prayers offered more comfort than cures. Some castles tried to manage waste with lime or ash, but the results were short-lived. The filth always returned, as if it had a claim to the stones. In winter, the waste sometimes froze, clinging to the edges of pits and walls. It made for easier removal, but harsher labour. In summer, the stench thickened the air. The contrast was sharp and inescapable, yet no one fled the castle for it, because outside there were wolves, bandits, or war. Better the stink of the garderobe than the stench of death on the battlefield. So we lived among our waste, not by choice, but by design. The castle, for all its majesty, held this truth within its bowels. And those of us who served or ruled learned, slowly and without fanfare, that even dignity must bend before the needs of the body. There was no escaping it, only endurance and a quiet turning of the nose. Silence was a rare and precious thing within a castle. The first light of dawn did not bring peace, but sound. The clatter of hooves in the courtyard, the calls of servants stirring fires, and the groan of doors too long hung on iron hinges. Sleep, when it came, was always light. I learned early to rest with one ear open, for quietness often meant something was amiss. Armour was never still. The squires polished it, adjusted it, carried it from chamber to chapel. The metal clanged with each motion, echoing down the stone halls like distant thunder. Even the gentlest step became a drumbeat when boots struck flagstone. There were times I longed for grass beneath my feet, for the hush of the forest. But within the castle, every surface sang, and none of its songs were soft. Then there were the hounds. Noble families kept dogs not just for hunting, but as companions and guards. They barked, whined, scratched at doors, and fought amongst themselves over scraps. Their howls echoed through the stairwells at night, sometimes chasing the moon, other times warning of strangers. I came to know each hound by voice alone, though I often wished them far from my chamber. Children too added their chorus. Noble or servant-born, their games resounded through corridors, their shouts unfiltered by stone. They ran, fell, laughed and wept, and none of it was quiet. Nannies tried in vain to hush them, but in truth, their noise was part of the life of the keep. I remember one boy's voice echoing so often in the same hallway that it became part of the place, as if the wall itself remembered him. Guards bellowed orders, cooks shouted across smoky kitchens, and blacksmiths hammered in rhythm. A single castle held dozens of souls, each carrying out their tasks, often loudly and without pause. Even the bells, for meals, for prayers, for curfew, rang with urgency. They did not ask politely. They demanded, and we answered them, weary or not. The great hall was rarely empty. Even when no feast was laid, it was a place of chatter, of meetings, of judgments passed, and news shared. Voices bounced off the vaulted ceilings, multiplied in echo. A man could speak at one end, and his words might travel to the other, It made secrets difficult and solitude nearly impossible. At night, when candles burned low and the corridors emptied, one might hope for calm. But the wind often had other plans. It howled through cracks and arrow slits, rattled wooden shutters, and whistled past the towers like a phantom. The creaking of old beams joined in, along with the distant creak of a gate or the flap of a loose banner. Even then, the castle breathed, never silent, always murmuring. It was in that unceasing noise that we lived, worked, and dreamed. I came to find a strange comfort in it, a rhythm of life, loud and relentless. Yet I never stopped yearning for a moment of stillness, a hush that would let me hear my own thoughts without interruption. In a castle, noise was the cost of safety, and peace, a luxury few ever truly knew. If the lords ruled by blood, the servants ruled by sweat. Long before the sun reached the battlements, the castle stirred with movement. Footsteps on stone, buckets sloshing, firewood crackling under fumbling hands. I remember their faces in the dim light of morning, red-eyed, silent, bent not by age, but by endless labor. They asked for no thanks, only bread and a place to sleep, though even these were not always certain. Each role had its place, and each body was bound to it. The scullery maid scrubbed greasy pans with torn hands. The stable boy rose before all others to feed the horses, his nose red with frost. The laundry women hauled wet garments, heavy and steaming, from the wash tub to the drying lines, their backs arched like bows. None sat idly, not even for a moment, for there was always more to be done. They ate standing, if they ate at all. A crust of bread, a ladle of stew, snatched between chores or at the hearth's edge. The kitchens were a world of their own, hot, loud, always frantic. I recall watching a cook berate a girl, no older than 12, for spilling broth meant for the Lord's Supper. She wept, but kept working. There was no room for weakness. Not in the kitchens. Not anywhere. At night, their rest was no better. The lucky ones had pallets near the kitchens, close to warmth, but thick with smoke. Others curled up in corners of cold halls, using folded cloaks as pillows. I've passed them on my way to midnight watch, asleep on stone floors, arms tucked beneath their heads, their dreams likely of labour, not of peace. No feather beds for them, no clean linen or chamber doors. Despite the hardship, they knew the castle better than any noble. It was they who kept the fires lit, the chambers swept, the wells full, and the candles trimmed. Without them, the great machine of life behind the walls would crumble. They were the unseen spine of the keep, bearing its weight with every silent task. Yet they were often spoken to as if they were part of the furniture, useful, but never praised. Punishment was swift and mercy rare. A broken goblet, a tardy task, or even a sour glance from the wrong person could mean a beating or dismissal. And dismissal was no light matter. To lose one's place was to risk starvation. The outside world held little welcome for those without coin or kin, so they stayed, endured, and bowed their heads, even when pride burned in their chests. Still, they found small joys. A joke shared in the pantry, a song hummed over a broom, the stolen warmth of a sunbeam through a high window. These brief flickers of light sustained them more than meat or coin. I remember one maid, Bess, who sang as she worked, her voice thin but sweet. She made the halls feel less hollow, if only for a moment. She reminded us all that humanity could survive even here. In the end, it was the servants who taught me what it meant to endure, not with blade or title, but with quiet resilience. They bore the castle not on their shoulders, but in their calloused hands and tired eyes. And though history rarely remembers their names, I do. Because without them, there would have been no castle to speak of, only cold walls, empty halls, and silence. Many believed that to be born into nobility was to be born into ease, golden goblets, feather beds, and idle hours. But I remember the weight of titles, heavier than any helm I ever wore. A lord did not lounge all day beneath tapestries. He rose early, met with stewards, settled disputes, received messengers, inspected the stores, and answered to the crown. His time was not his own. It belonged to the land, the people, and the oath he carried in his name. A lady's life was no less governed. While she may not have ridden into battle, she bore her own armour, the management of household staff, the education of children, the arrangement of marriages, and the hosting of guests. Her grace was measured not only in speech or dress, but in how smoothly her hall ran. I've seen noblewomen up before the dawn, inspecting linens, checking pantry stores, and preparing for a feast that would not end until stars pricked the sky. Every action, even in private, was bound by etiquette. A nobleman's words were watched, his posture corrected, his expressions measured, to show anger too freely, to laugh too loud, to stumble while addressing a lesser. Any misstep could breed rumour, insult, or worse. Feasts were not mere merriment, but theatre. One wrong glance could ignite a feud. Every bite of meat and lift of the goblet was part of a silent ritual older than many of us. Beyond the walls, the responsibilities deepened. Land had to be tended, taxes collected, disputes judged. A noble could not ignore the plight of a starving villager, nor the theft of a cow, nor a squire's misconduct. I recall a season when the rains failed, and I spent more time weighing grain rations and negotiating with priests than I did in the saddle. Justice was expected, swift, fair, and visible. Letters from the crown brought new burdens. One day a levy for troops, the next a summons to court, or orders to host visiting knights. Refusal was not an option, and each command disrupted the fragile balance of castle life. I remember cancelling a wedding feast because a bishop was due to arrive unexpectedly, his needs eclipsing all else, even joy. Then there were the ceremonies. Christenings, betrothals, funerals, each with its own script, attire, and expectations. I've stood through sermons in the cold for hours, numb in armour that pinched, knowing a single yawn could be interpreted as disrespect. My legs ached, my thoughts wandered, but my face remained still. That was the duty of a noble, to endure without complaint. Even war was not always glorious. A nobleman led men into battle, yes, but he also buried them. He read letters to grieving widows, negotiated truces, and dealt with ransom demands. I still carry the memory of a boy, no more than 15, who died under my command. His father was a lord, his mother a friend. I wrote them of his bravery, but not of his screams. So no, nobility was not leisure. It was service, shaped by lineage and bound in expectation. Our beds were finer, but our rest was no deeper. And though the world bowed to us, we too were prisoners, not of chains, but of duty. The meals within the castle were not the feasts one imagines from paintings or tales. Day by day, they were repetitive, coarse, and shaped by necessity more than delight. Bread was our staple, coarse, brown, and often hard by evening. We broke it with knives or soaked it in broth. White bread was rare, a luxury for the highest tables, and even then, only on feast days or in times of plenty. Meat was common, yet not always fresh. Salted pork, dried beef, or smoked fish made up much of the fare. Fresh kills were consumed quickly, for storage was difficult. In warm seasons, even the best cuts could turn before they reached the table. Spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, were used not to impress, but to hide the scent and taste of meat past its prime. I have chewed more than one roast that smelled more of the spice box than the beast. Vegetables were not abundant in winter, and even in summer, they were not the stars of the meal. Onions, leeks, and cabbages appeared often, boiled until soft and grey. Peas and beans filled stews, and turnips substituted for richer fare. I once ate a stew so bland that I envied the dog gnawing a bone beneath the table. At least his meal had flavour from the marrow. Fruit, when in season, was taken quickly and preserved if possible. Dried apples, pears, or prunes tucked away for colder months. Yet they lost their brightness, their sweetness fading with time. I remember a feast where a dish of candied quince was passed around as if it were treasure. Each guest took only a sliver, savouring the rare taste of sugar, more valuable than silver in many households. Feasts were grander, yes, boars, birds in pastry, pies with gilded crusts, but they were rare and meant for show. Often, the food at such tables was more spectacle than sustenance. I recall a swan presented whole, its feathers reattached, its beak gilded, its flesh dry and tasteless beneath the pomp. We applauded, but few enjoyed the bite. Ale and wine were drunk more than water, not for pleasure alone, but for safety. Water could carry sickness, and few trusted its source. Even children drank weak ale with their bread. I've watched mothers dip crusts in mead to quiet a crying babe. Not indulgence, but survival. Drunkenness was frowned upon, yet common, especially among those whose days held little comfort beyond the bottom of a cup. Hunger was not unknown, even within castle walls. In harsh winters, or during siege, the larders emptied quickly. I have eaten rats once, stewed with onion and strong herbs to disguise the truth. And I have seen noble children cry when their sweetmeats ran out, while the servants tightened their belts in silence. Hunger was the great equalizer, reminding all of us that rank did not fill the stomach. So we ate what we had, not always what we wanted, and in time, even the most delicate palate grew accustomed to sameness. The chew of salted meat, the crunch of stale bread, the sting of strong spices. Meals were a ritual, not a pleasure. And yet we gave thanks, because to eat at all in those days was a blessing, not a right. They were our constant companions, not by choice, but by circumstance. Rats and mice made their homes in the cracks of castle walls, beneath floorboards and among the stores of grain. No matter how high the tower or how grand the hall, the scurrying sound in the night was familiar to all. I remember waking to the scratch of tiny feet above my head and the cold certainty that nothing in that castle truly belonged to us alone. The granaries were never safe. Barrels were gnawed through, sacks torn open, and droppings found among the flour. We placed cats where we could, set traps with cheese or bread crusts, but they multiplied faster than we could control them. I once watched a rat brazenly trot across the high table during supper, fat and bold as any knight, as if mocking our illusion of control. But the rats were not the worst. It was their smaller kin, fleas, that tormented us beyond reason. They nested in straw mattresses, in woolen cloaks, and even in our hair. We scratched until we bled, and still they returned. Noble or servant, none were spared. I have seen a lady of high birth slap her arm mid-conversation, crushing a flea with more force than she used against any suitor. We tried remedies, lavender, rosemary, vinegar-soaked cloths, but none kept the infestation at bay for long. In the warmer months, the problem worsened. Sweat and heat gave fleas cause to thrive, and with them came disease. We did not understand how at the time, but we saw the signs, the bites that swelled and festered, the fevers that followed, the black swellings beneath the skin. We whispered of plague and buried the dead. Servants bore the brunt. Sleeping in crowded quarters, they were often the first to suffer. I once shared a chamber with 3 squires, all bitten so badly their legs looked scalded. We took turns boiling water to soak our linens, but the effort brought little relief. The fleas always returned. They had no fear of stone or steel. Even the dogs suffered. Their fur teemed with parasites, and their scratching filled the halls with an incessant rhythm. We tried combing them with fine-toothed bones, burning the fleas that jumped, but it was like emptying the sea with a cup. I recall a hound driven nearly mad, biting its own flank raw. The steward ordered it put down. not for cruelty, but for mercy. The misery crept into sleep. We tossed and turned, not from dreams, but from itching. Some wrapped their legs in oiled cloth before bed, hoping to keep the vermin out. Others drank until sleep overtook them completely. In the morning, we rose red-eyed and raw, muttering curses to the creatures too small to fight. It was not evil that made them, only nature. But in the quietest hours, when all else slept, the rustle of fur in the dark or the tickle on the skin reminded us that no stone wall, no high title, no drawn sword could keep the small horrors at bay. We were never alone, not in our beds, not in our halls. The castle had its own life, and it swarmed around us, unseen and unrelenting. It may seem strange to you now, traveller, but in my time, we rarely trusted water. Clear though it seemed, it often carried unseen death. Streams that bubbled near the castle walls ran down from farms and village latrines, collecting filth as they flowed. Wells were dug deep, but even they could sour, especially if too close to cesspits or waste piles. We learned not to drink blindly, or learned the hard way. Ale was our safeguard. Brewed with boiled water and low in strength, it was the drink of all, man, woman, and child. I have seen toddlers with tankards, sipping weak ale as their mothers mended clothing. Even monks, those paragons of virtue, kept breweries within their abbeys. They knew what we all knew, better to stagger slightly than to rot from within. Mead and wine followed the same wisdom, though more costly and reserved for tables with coin. There were those who believed in the purity of rainwater, catching it in barrels and cisterns. But that too came with risks. Birds soiled rooftops and standing water-bred insects. I once saw a boy, barely 10, drink from a mossy trough and take to his bed that same night, his belly cramping, his breath sour. By morning, he was gone. His mother wept quietly while scrubbing the same trough clean, as if penance could bring him back. Bathing in rivers was common when the weather allowed, but no one drank from them. We knew better. The water that cooled the skin could sicken the belly. And so we rinsed our mouths with wine, boiled water only when illness forced our hand, and prayed over our cups out of habit as much as faith. Water was life, yes, but also trickster and traitor. In times of siege, water became treasure. Wells were watched, guarded, rationed. Barrels were filled and sealed tight before the enemy drew near. I have tasted water gone stale from weeks in the dark, thick, musty, yet precious. I've also known the desperation of thirst, the madness it brings. One night I served beside drank from a moat during a siege. He died 2 days later, his lips black and cracked, his breath shallow as a dying fire. The kitchens boiled water for stews and porridges, but rarely for drinking. Firewood was precious, and the labour too great. Boiling a pot meant stirring coals, fanning flames, hauling buckets. Most preferred the ease of ale, and so did I. Even now I recall the taste of small beer, weak, yes, but safe. It filled the belly and eased the fear. Healers sometimes mixed water with herbs, believing it could purify. But more often, they used wine or honey to mask bitterness and fight infection. Water was the last resort, not the first. Only the poorest drank it pure, and often they paid dearly. I've seen entire hamlets vanish after a stream turned foul, their huts abandoned, the air heavy with silence and flies. So we lived wary of the very thing that gives life. And in that caution was wisdom, carved from pain. In your time, perhaps a glass of water is a blessing taken for granted. But for us, it was a gamble, and we did not have many chances to lose. In the close quarters of castle life, sickness was not a visitor. It was a resident. When one fell ill, many followed. The walls held us tight, and with them, they held the cough, the fever, the swelling. I have watched it begin with a single sneeze in the servants' hall, only to see a dozen faces pale by week's end. In a place where we slept shoulder to shoulder, shared cups, and breathed the same thick air, illness travelled faster than any messenger. Dysentery was the most common thief. It struck without warning, sudden cramps, foul water from the bowels, weakness that came like a storm. I recall a winter when 2 boys died within days, their strength drained before the priest could even bless them. We burned their bedding, scoured the floors with vinegar, and prayed, but still it spread. There was no hiding from it. Then came the fevers, slow burning and cruel. They left the skin hot and the spirit cold. Sometimes a healer was called, offering poultices or chants, but more often the sick were left in silence, attended only by those too kind or too afraid to flee. I sat beside a friend once, a fellow knight whose sweat soaked the mattress. He spoke of distant fields and childhood apples before his breath gave out. I remember wiping his brow with a torn sleeve because we had no linen left. Lice and fleas added to the misery. They nested in seams and straw, feeding on skin already worn by toil. With them came the plague, black swellings, breathless panic, and a silence that swallowed entire halls. We did not speak of it easily. The memory is still sharp. I saw 3 carts in one day bear bodies from the outer yard. A silence fell then, heavier than death. We stopped greeting each other. We stopped hoping. When sickness came, the first to suffer were always the poorest. The servants slept in clusters, bathed rarely, ate last. One ill girl could infect half the scullery. But disease respected no rank. I saw a countess die shivering under silk, her gold rings slipping from fingers gone thin. Her chambers, once bustling, fell still as a tomb. Medicine offered little comfort. A bleeding here, a leech there, sometimes a brew of herbs and oil. Prayers were given more freely than cures. The monks did what they could, blessing the dying, ringing bells, keeping records. But they too fell ill, and the churchyards filled. The dead outnumbered the living some seasons, and we ran out of cloth to shroud them. Some castles sealed themselves off at the first sign. No travellers allowed, no markets opened. But within, the sickness still found its path. Through rats, through servants, through air too heavy with breath. I remember the fear in every glance, the way we avoided touch, the nights spent awake listening for a cough that might never stop. Yet somehow we endured. The healthy buried the dead. The strong cared for the weak. And when spring returned, we swept the halls clean, lit the fires anew, and tried not to speak of what had passed. But we always remembered. Disease taught us that behind every stone wall, no matter how thick, we were still flesh, still mortal, still waiting for the next cough in the dark. Bathing, for most of us, was not a routine, but an ordeal. The gathering of water alone took hours, bucket after bucket drawn from the well or stream, hauled up steep stairs, and poured into tubs that leaked or groaned under the weight. Heating it required firewood, and firewood was precious, often saved for cooking or warmth. So we washed seldom, and when we did, it was an event rather than a habit. I remember my first full bath in the keep. A wooden tub in the corner of the kitchen, filled slowly as the stew boiled nearby. Servants shielded me with linen screens, more for form than true privacy. The water was already grey by the time it reached my knees, and cold before it touched my shoulders. Yet I sat still, grateful, for such moments came rarely, perhaps once a month, if that. Most days we managed with cloths, a damp rag scrubbed over arms and face, a handful of herbs rubbed beneath the arms, ashes scrubbed into the scalp to soak oil and sweat. Noblewomen had perfumes and rosewater. We had vinegar and sage. The smell of lavender in a chamber was more often a cover than a fragrance, hiding, not celebrating, the scent beneath. Shared baths were not uncommon. Families washed together, or in the case of servants, groups took turns in reused water. The idea of individual cleanliness was not as you know it. We believed in balancing the humours, not in rinsing them away. Sweat was a sign of strength, dirt a sign of toil. Only the vain or the very ill bathed too often, and even then, suspicion followed. Too much washing, they said, weakened the body. Public bathhouses did exist in towns, and I visited them once during my youth. Steam filled the air, bodies crowded shoulder to shoulder, laughter echoing off tiled walls. But in time, they fell into disrepute, places of gossip, of sin, or worse. Some were shuttered by the church, others by fear when plague threatened. Better to smell of effort than to bathe with death. In winter, the thought of bathing chilled the bones. Ice had to be broken to draw water, and warming it took twice the fire. Many simply endured the filth until spring. I once went 6 weeks without so much as washing my feet. My boots clung to me like bark, and my skin itched with dried sweat and dust. Yet no one commented. We all wore the same invisible layer of winter. Children fared no better. Mothers wiped them down when they could, but lice were constant companions, and rashes appeared like unwelcome guests. The sick were sometimes bathed in warm broth or wine, if the family could afford it, not to cleanse, but to ease the fever. The rest of us bathed only when occasion forced our hand, a wedding, a feast, a holy day. So we lived in our own skin and all that clung to it. We bore the smell of smoke, sweat, and toil as part of life, not as a flaw. Cleanliness as you know it belonged more to spirit than to body. And in those stone halls, what mattered most was not how one smelled, but how one endured. Through the seasons, through the labor, through the quiet ache of being always and utterly human. A castle, grand though it stood, was never a place of true peace. Its very shape, thick walls, towers, narrow slits for arrows, whispered of danger. We built them not for beauty, but for war. And though the banners flew high and the feast halls echoed with laughter, every man within those walls knew the threat was never far. At any hour, a horn could sound, a fire could rise, and the calm could shatter. I remember the feeling, that heaviness in the chest when rumour spread of approaching raiders. Whether from a rival lord, a distant king, or mercenaries grown restless, the threat came often and in many forms. We watched the horizon like it held prophecy. The colour of the sky at dawn, the flight of birds, the silence of the woods, all were signs to those of us who had seen siege before. Siege was not swift. It was slow, cruel, grinding. The enemy did not storm the walls on day one. They waited. They cut off supplies. They poisoned wells, blocked roads, and sent arrows over the battlements at night to rob us of sleep. Hunger grew sharper than any sword. Bread stretched thinner each day. We rationed candles, even laughter, as if joy itself must be saved. Inside, tempers flared. The noblewoman feared for her children. The steward argued with the cook. Guards grew restless, and young squires looked to the sky, praying for clouds that never came. I once watched a grown man cry over a spoiled sack of flour. Not for the waste, but for what it meant. Another day closer to weakness, and the enemy still waiting beyond the trees. When the attack came, it was thunderous. Stones flung from trebuchets shook the earth. Arrows blackened the sky. I've stood atop a wall as fire rained down, the air hot with smoke and fear. We poured boiling oil, dropped stones, loosed bolts from crossbows. And still they came. The enemy was not always evil, just desperate as we. Even when peace returned, the fear lingered. Scouts were sent, gates double locked, and children warned not to speak to strangers. We inspected the walls, repaired the cracks, sharpened the blades. There was no celebration, only the quiet return to duty. Victory was not joy, it was survival, and we knew it was only temporary. In borderlands, the threat never truly left. Some lords slept in mail, some kept horses saddled at all hours. I recall a night in the north when wolves howled louder than usual and the guards doubled their rounds. The threat was not from beasts, but from men with torches and cores. That night passed quietly, but none of us slept. So we lived within walls, not because they were strong, but because the world outside was stronger still. Every stone laid was a prayer for safety, but no wall, no tower, no iron gate could ever promise peace. A castle stood not to bring rest, but to delay ruin. And those of us within learned to live with one eye always open and one hand never far from the hilt. When night fell upon the castle, it brought not darkness alone, but a kind of blindness. The thick stone walls and narrow windows held back the sun, and once it fled the sky, only fire remained. Candles of tallow sputtered in their holders, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts. Their scent was sharp, a blend of smoke and animal fat that clung to the air long after the flame died. Torches were brighter, yes, but crude. Their flames licked high and spat sparks when jostled. They smoked heavily, leaving black streaks above sconces and in the corners of vaulted ceilings. The servants tasked with replacing them moved like shadows themselves, quick and quiet, carrying fire from one chamber to the next, as if they bore a fragile secret. I recall many nights walking corridors lit by a single flame, the rest swallowed in gloom. Lanterns helped little. Iron cages with bits of horn or oiled cloth made the light dim and yellow, more eerie than comforting. We placed them at crossroads within the castle, near stairwells, outside kitchens, beside the chapel door. Yet still, the dark pressed in. There were halls where the light never reached, where even in daylight one needed a torch to see clearly. I passed through such places often, the silence and shadow wrapping close. Even in noble chambers, illumination was poor. Chandeliers of iron held a dozen candles at most, and wax was costly. They were lowered only for special occasions. Most nights, a single candle near the bed sufficed, its weak glow illuminating only a circle of stone and skin. I have lain in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the flame whisper as it burned, seeing only outlines, never details. Reading by such light was a strain. Scribes and clerks worked during the day for that very reason. At night, even the most educated among us put down the quill. I have seen men go half blind by 40 from years of squinting over parchment in poor light, and women sewing by candlelight often pricked their fingers raw. We did not speak of it as hardship. It was simply how things were. Smoke filled every chamber. It hung low in winter when hearths burned without rest. The great hall, despite its high beams and open vents, was often blue with it. My eyes watered during meals, not from emotion, but from the sting of poor ventilation. Guests coughed, children sneezed, and still we pressed on, eating and speaking as though the air were clear. What choice was there? Fires were both blessing and threat. A stray spark, a knocked candle, a curtain too close to flame. These could end a life or bring down a wing of the keep. I recall a stable fire that began from a lantern set too low. The horses screamed into the night, and 3 boys were lost trying to save them. After that, we posted watches not for men, but for fire itself. So the castle was never truly bright, even on feast days or high celebrations. Light was a treasure, paid for in labor and wax, in smoke and risk. We learned to live with dimness, to trust our steps and sharpen our ears. And in time, the flicker of a lone candle came to mean more than a chandelier ever could, for in the dark, even the smallest light was a comfort, a promise that we were not entirely lost. The halls of the castle echoed with many voices, but the voice of a woman was rarely heard in command. From the day of her birth, a noble woman's path was shaped by duty, to her father, to her husband, and to her sons. I remember them well, graceful, poised, silent when expected, smiling when it pained them. Their lives were bound in fine cloth, but their freedom was no less shackled than a prisoner's. Marriage was not a matter of love, but of alliance. A girl of 12 might be betrothed to a man thrice her age if it served the family's cause. She was a vessel, for heirs, for land, for honor. Her wishes were not asked. Her silence was assumed. I recall a lady, barely of age, weeping quietly behind the altar as vows were spoken on her behalf. Her tears fell unseen, not because no one looked, but because no one dared to name them. Within the castle, her realm was the household. She managed servants, arranged linens, oversaw the larder. These were her domains, and she ran them with a discipline that rivaled any steward. Yet beyond those walls, her presence was restricted. A woman could not own land outright, could not speak at court uninvited, could not ride alone beyond the gate. Her world was vast in duty, narrow in reach. Books were scarce for all, but scarcer still for women. Some learned to read prayers, a few to write letters, but most knowledge was passed down in whispers, from mother to daughter, from nursemaid to child. I've seen women teaching one another herbal lore in the corners of the garden, exchanging wisdom like contraband. What power they had, they wielded subtly, lest it be mistaken for rebellion. Childbearing defined them. It was not a single event, but a lifelong calling. Some bore a dozen children and buried half. I have seen a lady walk days after childbirth to attend her husband's feast, pale and shaking beneath her silks. Death in childbirth was common, but rarely discussed. It was the silent spectre at every cradle, the quiet prayer beneath every lullaby. And yet, in times of war, it was often the woman who held the keys. When husbands marched off, they remained, managing the keep, negotiating with messengers, even rallying men to defend the walls. Their strength, though seldom praised, was undeniable. I served under one such lady once, Lady Marjorie of the Western March. Her orders were clear, her gaze sharper than any blade. She saved her people, yet her story is rarely told. Some rebelled in quiet ways, a lover kept in secret, a letter hidden in embroidery, a refusal to smile when the Lord demanded it. These were risks, sometimes fatal. Adultery could mean death. Defiance could mean exile to a nunnery. But still, they resisted, not always in grand gestures, but in the quiet claiming of their own thoughts. So, when you imagine the women of the castle, do not think only of courtly love or silken gowns. Think of quiet endurance, of wisdom passed in silence, of strength woven into each stitch and smile. Their chains were not always visible, but they bore them with dignity. And in their stillness was a power few dared to name, a power born not of freedom, but of resilience. In the world I knew, marriage was not the joining of hearts, but of houses. Love, if it bloomed, was an accident, a flower in a field ploughed for grain. The union of two souls was far less important than the union of titles, lands, and alliances. I have attended weddings where the bride and groom had not spoken a word before the vows were exchanged. Their hands met not in affection, but in obligation. Betrothals were often arranged in childhood. A girl of 10 promised to a boy of 12, their futures sealed by ink and wax long before they understood what it meant. I have seen contracts drawn with more care than prayers, detailing dowries, inheritance, and feudal loyalties. The marriage itself was a seal, not upon the hearts, but upon the parchment. And once sealed, it was rarely broken. The bride brought with her land, coin, or cattle. The groom brought his name, his rank, or his sword. Feelings were secondary. A lady's beauty was noted, yes, but her worth lay in what she brought to the alliance. I recall a noble who refused his match because she was lame in one leg. His father struck him for it, not out of cruelty, but because the girl's dowry included 2 fertile valleys. The marriage went forward. The limp was ignored. Weddings were grand affairs, not for the couple, but for their families. Feasts, music, games, gifts, all to display wealth and power. I remember one wedding where the bride barely smiled, her eyes darting to her nursemaid with every toast. Her husband drank deeply, laughed loudly, and never once looked at her with gentleness. That was not expected of him. He had done his duty by marrying her. Once wed, the wife's role was clear: bear children, manage the household, uphold the family name. The husband was expected to lead, defend, and provide heirs. Affection, if it came, was considered a blessing, not a right. I knew a couple who learned to love each other over years of hardship. But I also knew many who lived side by side as strangers, their only connection the children they bore. Infidelity was treated unequally. A man who strayed was forgiven, sometimes even admired. A woman who did so risked ruin, public shame, banishment, or death. I once witnessed a trial where a young woman, accused of unfaithfulness, was stripped of her lands and sent to a convent. Her husband had a known mistress, yet he stood in judgment, his honor untarnished. Such was the law, and few questioned it. There were exceptions, rare, bright things. A widow who refused to remarry, a couple who eloped and lived in exile. But their stories were whispered, not celebrated. The structure held firm, and those who defied it paid dearly. Still, some dared. Perhaps love burns hotter when forbidden, or perhaps it is simply the one thing that cannot be bartered. So remember, when you think of castle weddings, not the gowns or the garlands, but the contracts signed in candlelight, not the kiss, but the coin exchanged. Marriage in my time was not the beginning of love. It was the conclusion of negotiation, and for most, it was the price paid for a place at the table. In the castles where I served, knowledge was a guarded thing, precious, narrow, and given only to those deemed worthy by birth or by faith. The ability to read and write was not common, even among nobles. It was a privilege, not a right, and those who held the keys to learning were often monks, scribes, or tutors hired at great expense. Books were few, and each one a treasure, handwritten, bound in leather, and locked away more often than read. Boys of noble blood were sometimes taught Latin, history, and the laws of the land. But more often, they learned through practice: how to ride, how to wield a sword, how to manage a state and men. I remember crouching over scrolls in a smoky chamber, struggling with unfamiliar words while my master paced behind me. The rod was near at hand, not for decoration, but for discipline. Learning was not sweetened with praise, it was demanded. Girls, if taught at all, were instructed in sewing, manners, music, and prayer. Their learning was meant to serve the household, not the mind. I knew a young lady, bright and curious, who longed to study the stars. Her father forbade it. "Leave the heavens to God and his monks," he said, and so she embroidered constellations instead, her needle her only means of expression. The church held most knowledge. Monasteries housed libraries, rows of sacred texts, ancient philosophies, and natural law. But even within those walls, access was limited. A young monk might spend years copying a single manuscript, never permitted to read it fully. The act of copying itself was considered holy. Understanding the words was secondary. I recall visiting a scriptorium where the air was thick with dust and silence. The only sounds were quills on parchment and whispered prayers. Outside the walls, education was rarer still. Peasants knew only what life taught them: how to till the soil, tend the animals, survive the winter. Their wisdom was deep, but unwritten. They passed knowledge through song and story, through example and memory. I listened once to an old shepherd explain the seasons better than any scholar I'd met. His words held truth, though no ink would ever preserve them. Books were scarce because they took years to create. One volume could cost as much as a horse. Illuminated manuscripts, with their gold leaf borders and vibrant inks, were prized beyond measure. I held one once, a psalter, gifted to a dying knight. He wept as he touched its pages, not for the words, but for the thought that such beauty had been made by human hands. That moment remains with me still. Not all learning was welcomed. Ideas that strayed from doctrine were labelled heresy. I knew a friar burned for owning a text that questioned the nature of sin. The fire that consumed his body also consumed the book, and with it, perhaps some truth we shall never reclaim. Knowledge, in those days, was not free. It was chained by fear, by law, by those who feared what it might awaken. So we lived in a world where ignorance was common and protected. But even in that world, minds sought more. In whispered questions, in stolen hours with parchment, in the eyes of a child watching the stars, I saw the hunger for understanding. It flickered, quiet but constant, a light not even the thickest stone could extinguish. Though they stood as symbols of power, castles were often built far from the bustle of towns. Their locations were chosen not for comfort, but for strategy, high on ridges, deep in forests, or surrounded by moats and marshes. The goal was defense, not connection. I remember standing atop a tower, gazing across miles of empty field and twisted road, knowing the nearest market lay 2 days' ride away. This distance meant safety in times of war, but hardship in times of peace. Trade came slowly, if at all. Merchants hesitated to travel rough roads unless well paid or under escort. Salt, wool, spices, all arrived at a cost. I once waited weeks for a shipment of ink, only for it to arrive half spilled and frozen. We adapted. We preserved what we could, reused until frayed, and learned not to depend on anything outside our walls. Healers were hard to reach. If illness struck and the castle's own herb woman was unsure, a messenger had to ride to the nearest monastery or town physician. I have seen lives lost in the time it took help to arrive. By the time a learned man crossed the hills with his satchel of remedies, the fever had claimed its victim, and still we sent for them, for hope is a stubborn thing. Priests and friars visited when they could, but often a single chaplain served the entire household. He baptized, buried, and offered mass in a small chapel lit by a single candle. Confession was whispered in a corner, not a booth. I remember one Lent when the snow blocked all roads, and no clergy came. The lady of the house led the prayers herself, her voice trembling but resolute. Mail was no guarantee. Letters could be stolen, lost, or delayed for months. A call for aid in war might arrive too late. I recall a siege where we waited for reinforcements promised by a cousin lord. They came, 4 days after the enemy had already retreated. The messenger blamed a broken wheel and bad weather. We did not fault him. We knew the roads all too well. Even simple pleasures were scarce. Minstrels and performers rarely ventured so far unless invited for feasts. News came by word of mouth, carried on the lips of travellers, pilgrims, or wandering knights. Rumours flourished. One might hear of a king's death weeks after the burial, or not at all. Truth and tale walked hand in hand, and no one could say where one ended and the other began. The isolation was felt most in winter. Snow closed the roads, and we became a world unto ourselves. No visitors, no trade, no news. Just the same faces, the same duties, the same cold silence broken by wind through the cracks. I have known men to grow restless, even mad, in such times, speaking to walls, pacing like wolves in a cage. So yes, castles offered protection. But that protection came at a price. The price of distance, of delay, of solitude. And while the city bustled with life and laughter, the castle stood in stillness, watching from afar. A fortress, yes, but also a kind of prison, carved in stone and shaped by the loneliness between its walls and the rest of the world. Life within the castle was shaped by duty and silence, but now and then a breath of music or laughter stirred the stillness. Entertainment, when it came, was brief and often simple. A song in the great hall, a game of dice, or the telling of tales. Yet it was not abundant, and certainly not varied. I recall long evenings where the same melodies played over and over, the notes as familiar as the creak of the floorboards beneath us. Minstrels were welcome guests, but not common. They arrived with lutes and riddles, their boots caked in road dust, their voices worn thin by miles. A good minstrel might be kept for days, playing in exchange for food and coin. I remember one who sang of Charlemagne with such sorrow in his voice that even the dogs grew quiet. When he left, the hall seemed emptier, the nights longer. We would not hear another new song for months. Feasts brought brief excitement, jesters, tumblers, perhaps a dancing bear led by a chain. But these were reserved for high occasions, weddings, victories, the arrival of a bishop. The rest of the year, we made do with what we had. Card games, chess, and storytelling passed the time. The stories, though, rarely changed. Arthur, Roland, saints, and sinners. Their names echoed through the hall like worn prayer. Children played with carved dolls, wooden swords, or hoops, and their laughter filled the corridors. Yet even their games repeated. I once asked a young page why he no longer laughed at the jester's tricks. "I've seen them all," he said, not bitterly, just plainly. And he was right. Novelty was rare, and we learned early to take comfort in the familiar rather than chase the new. Winter made it worse. The cold drove us indoors, the roads closed, and the days shrank. Evenings stretched long. We sang hymns, sometimes read from a psalter if one was available, or simply sat by the fire in silence. I once passed a week carving a chess piece from bone, just to give my hands something to do. When it was done, I had no opponent to play against. I carried it in my pouch for years. Some found joy in craft, embroidery, woodwork, or the copying of texts. These acts gave shape to the hours, though they were more labor than leisure. One cook I knew sang while stirring pots, her songs the same each season. They comforted the servants more than the food did. Even repetition, when gentle, could soothe the soul. Dancing happened on feast days, sometimes led by pipers or drummers, but it was brief and constrained by custom. A lady's hand could not linger in yours. A man's gaze must not wander. I have danced beneath banners while thinking of nothing but the ache in my knees and the time still left before I could rest. Joy was permitted, but only in measured steps, so we lived in a rhythm of sameness. The laughter we shared was quiet, the diversions simple, the days long and echoing. Entertainment did not mean escape. It meant endurance. A brief lifting of the weight, a breath drawn before the work began again. And for that, we were grateful. Even a single song could keep a man's spirit from sinking too deep into the silence. Winter in a castle was not the serene snowfall of paintings or poems. It was long, bitter, and merciless. The stone walls that guarded us from enemies also trapped the cold within. Fires roared in great hearths, yet their warmth rarely reached beyond a few paces. I have sat at a lord's table with frozen toes, my breath curling in the air between bites of steaming stew. The chill was a second skin, always there, always biting. Servants rose in darkness, their fingers numb as they lit the first fires. The straw-stuffed mattresses were damp and stiff with frost. Blankets, often made of wool or fur, were shared in crowded rooms. But warmth was a fleeting thing. I recall huddling with two squires under a single cloak, each of us pretending sleep had come while the cold gnawed at our joints. Water in the basins froze overnight, and breaking the ice each morning became part of the ritual. Washing one's face was a punishment rather than refreshment. Windows, when they had coverings at all, were shuttered tight, but drafts slipped through every crack. We hung thick tapestries and stuffed gaps with rags and straw, but the cold always found a way in. It moved like a spirit, silent, invasive, unrelenting. Outside, the world was worse. Paths vanished beneath snow, and horses slipped on hidden ice. Travel was dangerous. Messengers often never returned. I once found a stable hand frozen where he stood, his arms locked around a sack of grain. He had gone to feed the livestock before dawn, and the cold had claimed him before the rooster crowed. His body was buried that same day, beneath frozen earth that broke our shovels. Inside the castle, fires were precious but perilous. Chimneys backed up, filling chambers with smoke. Sparks leapt onto dry rushes, and the fear of fire was as constant as the cold itself. We dared not let the flames burn too high nor too long unattended. I remember one winter when a fire spread through the upper rooms, destroying the bedchambers. We fought it with wet cloaks and buckets of snow. No one slept that night. Food grew scarce. The cellars held salted meat, dried beans, hard cheese, all rationed carefully. Fresh produce was a memory. Even the rats grew bold, chewing into stores in search of crumbs. Hunger added to the cold, hollowing faces and shortening tempers. I saw men fight over a crust of bread, and children stare silently at empty bowls. The wind outside howled like a beast, but it was the silence of empty larders that frightened me more. Illness thrived in the winter. Coughs turned to fevers and fevers to funerals. The cold weakened the body, and disease crept in with ease. We wrapped ourselves in layers, burned herbs to purify the air, and prayed each night that the morning would find us still breathing. Not all prayers were answered. I have buried friends before the spring thaw, their names spoken only once more, when the chaplain lowered his eyes. Yet we endured. We always did. We told stories by the fire, shared what little we had, and waited for the day when the first bird would sing again. Winter taught us humility, taught us patience. It carved lines in our faces and strength in our bones. And when the thaw finally came, it felt like grace, not joy, but relief. The kind that comes only after walking through months of frozen silence and finding yourself still on the other side. In the castle, childhood was brief, more a pause than a season. From the moment a child could walk and speak, they were shaped for the role that awaited them. A boy of 7 might leave his mother's side to become a page, already learning the art of service, speech, and sword. A girl of the same age would be handed a needle, a set of prayers, and the expectations of womanhood. There was little room for play. I recall a young boy named Thomas, no older than my belt buckle, scrubbing armor and memorizing heraldry, while other children elsewhere might have chased birds in a meadow. His fingers were red with cold, but he dared not complain. He addressed knights with bowed head, learned to serve wine without spilling, and stood silent as lords quarrelled over land. This was his schooling, not numbers or verse, but obedience and poise. Daughters of nobility were trained to manage households, soothe tempers, and smile when spoken to. They practiced curtsies and memorized family lineages. Dolls were not for comfort, but tools, tiny models of the care they would one day give their own households. I once watched a girl no older than 10 comfort a crying infant, while her own eyes held the stillness of someone twice her age. There was no room for dreams, only preparation. Punishment was common, often harsh. A boy who forgot his duties might be struck or denied food. A girl who spoke too boldly might be rebuked before guests. We believed then that discipline was love, that shaping a child early would spare them pain later. I see now how heavy those hands were and how much silence they taught. Children learned fear before freedom and duty before desire. Even play, when permitted, had a purpose. Wrestling taught strength. Games of mimicry rehearsed social roles. Boys staged mock duels with wooden swords, learning the postures of knighthood. Girls mimicked feasts with dried berries and scraps of cloth, practicing for future halls. There was joy in these moments, but it was tethered, never wild, never free. Laughter was soft, contained, watched from afar. Some children served other households, sent away as a gesture of alliance or advancement. I've known boys who wept quietly in their sleep, missing mothers they might never see again, and girls who arrived with dowries and dreams, only to find cold stone and colder glances. They adapted, as children do, but the cost was steep. Their innocence, traded for position, rarely returned. Still, bonds were formed. Pages became squires, squires became knights, handmaids became confidants. In the long hours of shared labour and whispered secrets, friendships grew that outlasted title or time. I owe my life to a man who once shared a crust with me when we were both boys in livery. In a world so ordered and harsh, such kindness was a rebellion. So when I remember the children of the castle, I do not see wide-eyed wonder or carefree joy. I see small shoulders bearing heavy weights. I see futures assigned before the first tooth was lost. And yet, I also see strength, quiet, enduring, blooming in shadow. For even in a place that demanded much too soon, the heart of a child still beat, and sometimes, miraculously, it endured. Justice in the castle was not cloaked in silence or secrecy. It rang out in the square, echoed through the halls, and etched itself into memory with every cry and gasp. Punishment was spectacle, designed to instruct as much as to correct. I have stood beside the stocks, watching a man's shame unfold before a jeering crowd, his crime carved into a board hung about his neck. Theft, disobedience, insolence, all met with swift, visible consequence. The stocks and pillory were common. Offenders stood locked in wood, their limbs stiff, their skin blistering under sun or freezing wind. Children pointed, adults muttered, and sometimes worse, a spoiled egg, a stone, a curse from a passing widow. I recall a boy, barely grown, sentenced for insulting a knight's squire. He wept the whole day, not from pain, but from the humiliation. That pain lingered long after the bruises faded. For servants and lower folk, beatings were frequent. A rod across the back, a slap with an iron ring, or lashes in the courtyard were meted out with little ceremony. Blood on the stone was washed with a bucket, and the day continued. Once, I saw a cook whipped for burning a pie, meant for the visiting abbot. Her cries mingled with the bells of vespers, and none intervened. It was seen as just. More serious crimes brought harsher ends. Thieves lost hands, traitors lost heads. The executioner was both feared and familiar, a man cloaked in black who spoke little and drank much. I remember the sound of his axe as it struck the block, a sound that echoed louder than any sermon. The silence that followed was heavier still. Not all screamed. Some stared into the sky as if waiting for mercy. I never saw it come. Justice for women was no gentler. Accused of adultery, they could be beaten, banished, or worse. A serving girl once fell pregnant by a visiting knight. She bore the shame. He rode on. The Lord declared her wicked and had her whipped publicly before sending her to the convent. I saw her eyes as they led her away, not tearful, just hollow, as if the world had gone quiet within her. Children were not spared either. A page who dropped a lord's goblet might be beaten before the hall. Discipline was thought to shape character. We did not speak of scars, only of obedience. I carry my own reminders still, faint but never forgotten. Each one a lesson, taught not by words, but by pain. Yet punishment was not always fair. The highborn were judged more gently. A noble who lied might face exile or loss of land. A peasant who lied faced the stocks. I have seen the same crime met with two fates, depending on name and coin. Justice, we said, was blind, but it often peeked beneath the cloth, so we feared not only the law, but the way it was delivered. Public punishment was as much a performance as it was a sentence. It reminded all who watched, step out of line, and this could be you. And though we called it order, it was fear that kept the peace. A fear we carried like a shadow, long and sharp, beneath the cold stone sky. Every stone in a castle was laid with war in mind. Its towers pointed not to the heavens in beauty, but to see farther, to shoot farther. The walls were not warm or welcoming. They were thick, unyielding, and meant to keep death at bay. I remember walking those narrow corridors, my hand brushing cold mortar, the ceiling low above my helm. There was no softness here. The castle was a fortress first, and a home only by necessity. Staircases spiraled tightly, always to the right when ascending, so that defenders had freedom to swing their swords and attackers were cramped. I have climbed those steps in armor, lungs burning, feet slipping on worn stone. There was no grace in it, only function. Windows were arrow slits, mere cracks in the wall. Light struggled through them. Air moved little. We lived in shadow and silence, the price of protection. Doors were small, thresholds thick. Each one a choke point, a delay to slow an enemy. Some were iron-bound and took 2 men to open. Others were kept barred unless a noble approached. I remember guards sleeping beside the main gate, spears in hand, always ready to rise at the sound of hooves or horn. There was no hour when the castle truly rested. The great hall might seem grand, but even it was built with siege in mind. Raised platforms, narrow side doors, a hearth large enough to warm many, but also to signal those outside. The floor was stone or packed earth, cold in winter, hard year-round. Tapestries hung not only for beauty, but to soften sound and slow arrows. The banners above were not just colours, but warnings, messages for friend and foe alike. Comfort was a stranger. Beds were stiff, made of straw or wood, often shared. Walls dripped with damp, chimneys smoked and failed. Water had to be hauled, waste carried out. I recall the Lord's chamber itself, a place of authority, yes, but one where wind whistled through the cracks, and the hearth barely kept the chill at bay. Even nobility lived with discomfort, cloaked in velvet, but never far from the bite of stone. The castle's strength was also its weight. It took hours to move from one tower to another, to send a message from kitchen to guardroom. Servants ran endlessly, their feet echoing down the passageways. In times of siege, this slowness turned dangerous. A delay at the gatehouse, a misheard signal, and lives could be lost. We drilled constantly, not for show, but because confusion meant death. Outside, the walls loomed, steep, scarred, unwelcoming. I have stood at the parapet in the driving rain, watching a column of riders approach, unsure if they brought bread or blood. The towers gave us vantage, but not certainty. A mistake, and the castle could become a tomb. Its strength relied not on stone alone, but on those who knew its paths, its defenses, its weak points. So no, the castle was not a palace. It was a shell meant to shield, not to soothe. We lived in its belly like sailors in a storm-tossed ship, trusting the wood, fearing the sea. And though it protected us, it also wore us down. A castle was a place to survive, not to rest. Its beauty, if any, lay not in ease, but in endurance. We did not eat alone in the castle. Unseen, unwanted guests shared every store of grain, every sack of flour, every smoked ham. Insects were constant, as familiar as the cold and far harder to avoid. I have opened barrels of oats only to find them writhing, tiny beetles burrowing between kernels, moths fluttering up in panic. Hunger makes a man look past many things, even the twitch of a leg in his bread. Grain attracted weevils, small, hard-shelled, relentless. They chewed through wooden bins and cloth coverings alike. We tried to store our food in stone cellars, raised off the ground, sealed in barrels. But still they came. I remember a time when half the winter wheat had to be thrown to the pigs, and even they sniffed it before eating. The steward wept that day, not from sentiment, but from the weight of loss. Flour, too, was never safe. Open a sack, and you'd often find worms or dark specks that moved when the light hit them right. Cooks learned to sift carefully, a wide mesh over a bowl, shaking it gently, praying that what fell was only flour. But even with effort, some always slipped through. We joked grimly that extra protein made us strong. No one laughed very loudly. Dried meat attracted flies, and their eggs turned to maggots in warm months. Even salted hams hung high in the rafters weren't immune. I've cut into a slab only to find the heart of it spoiled, crawling. The outer layer might be clean, the inside lost. We sliced carefully, trimmed liberally, and fed what remained to the dogs. Or, when stores ran low, we steeled ourselves and ate what we must. Fruit was often dried or preserved in honey, not for taste, but for protection. Fresh apples turned soft quickly, pears went to rot, and dried figs could carry bugs within their folds. I once bit into one and found the husk of something long dead inside. After that, I never touched figs again. The sweet smell, once pleasant, now turned my stomach. Cheese sometimes fared better, but even it was no sanctuary. Mites clung to the rinds, and blue veins of mold crept deeper than expected. We scraped and cut, always wary. Some cheeses were meant to be pungent, others were simply gone too long. It was often hard to tell the difference. The mouth could not always trust the eye. The servants did what they could, sweeping storerooms, setting bay leaves among the grain, airing sacks in the sun. But there were too few hands, too little time. I've seen pantries closed off with iron nails, only to be opened months later to find the ruin already done. Rats were blamed, but more often it was the smallest things that did the most harm. And yet, we ate. We picked out the worst, blessed the rest, and swallowed what the season gave. Insects were not a sign of neglect. They were simply part of life. We did not speak of them at the table, nor dwell on them after. Hunger left no room for disgust. Only gratitude that there was still something left to eat, something to carry us one more day toward the spring. The kitchen in a castle was a place of heat, haste, and hazard. It was not the warm, fragrant haven you might imagine. It was a forge of sweat and flame, filled with noise and peril. Fires roared in open hearths, large enough to roast whole beasts. Cauldrons steamed, knives flashed, and the scent of smoke mingled with grease until it clung to every wall, every cloak, every strand of hair. I spent many hours there, not as a cook, but as a hungry observer, and I still remember the sting of the air. The cooks, mostly women and older men, worked from before dawn until well after the last bowl was cleared. Their hands were red from boiling water, their sleeves singed, their feet always in motion. The hearth was the heart of it all, wide, deep, dangerous. I once saw a girl stumble while tending a spit and fall forward. She lived, but the scars ran from wrist to shoulder. We never spoke of it again, but her silence at meals said enough. Cooking over open flame demanded constant watchfulness. One missed moment, and a stew could boil over, a pie could burn, a fire could leap from the grate to the rushes on the floor. Buckets of sand and water were always kept nearby, but when the flames rose, panic was faster than preparation. I recall a feast when the meat caught fire mid-turning. The scent was rich, but so was the fear. Only quick hands and damp cloaks saved the meal, and the kitchen. The labor was endless. Meat had to be butchered, bread kneaded, herbs chopped, and everything carried. Upstairs, down corridors, from cellar to hall. I've seen boys no older than 10 staggering under pots half their size, slipping on grease-slick stones, eyes wide with fear of dropping even a drop. Dropping food could mean punishment, not just hunger. A noble's table did not forgive mistakes, no matter the hands that toiled to fill it. Ovens were deep and dark, often built of stone. Reaching into them was an act of faith, and sometimes pain. Burns were so common that they went unnamed, just another ache among many. Flies buzzed despite our efforts, and dogs lingered at the door, hoping for scraps. Cleanliness was a struggle. Ash drifted into dough, sweat into stew. But there was no time for perfection, only survival, only speed. Feasts, when they came, were storms. Dozens of mouths to feed, courses upon courses, dishes served hot and swift. The kitchen became a blur of movement. Voices shouted orders, knives slammed against boards, and the fire glowed brighter than the sun outside. When the final dish left the hearth, the cooks often collapsed onto benches, eating whatever crusts remained, their faces streaked with smoke and triumph. And yet, for all its hardship, the kitchen was also a place of pride. A well-fed hall meant honor. The cook who pleased the Lord earned more trust than the steward. I remember a dish of spiced pheasant that brought a rare smile to a hardened baron. The cook received a coin and a nod, more than many earned in a year. She tucked the coin into her apron and returned to stirring her broth, wordless and calm. So when you think of castle meals, think not only of what was eaten, but of what was endured to place it on the table. Behind every roasted goose and fragrant pie stood hours of danger, sweat, and skill. The kitchen was not gentle, but it was vital. And in its fire, more than food was forged. There, in the heat and haste, loyalty was tested, and quiet strength was born. Of all the tasks that filled the castle's days, none was more dreaded, or more exhausting, than the washing of clothes. It was not a weekly ritual, but a laborious undertaking saved for when necessity forced our hand. Garments were worn until stiff with sweat, stained with soot and grease, heavy with the sense of labor. When the time came to wash them, it was not a matter of soap and basin. It was a campaign of effort, pain, and patience. First came the gathering. Bundles of linens, woolen cloaks, undergarments, and bed coverings were hauled from chambers and servant quarters. I recall the look on a laundress's face as she surveyed the pile. Not horror, merely resignation. She knew what lay ahead. Days of boiling, scrubbing, wringing, and drying. Her hands were already raw, her back already bent. Water had to be fetched, bucket after bucket from the well or stream, and fires stoked until the great cauldrons bubbled. Ashes were sometimes added to make lye, which burned the skin as much as it cleansed the cloth. The smell was acrid, and the steam thick. I once tried to help in winter. My fingers turned blue before midday. The laundresses laughed, not unkindly, and sent me back to my post, wiser and humbler. Washing was done with stones or wooden paddles, garments laid across boards and beaten until the dirt loosened. Scrubbing often tore the fabric. Clothes did not last long. Noble garments might be handled with care, but the rest, tunics, hose, aprons, were battered into submission. The air rang with slaps and splashes, the work rhythmical, back-breaking, and cold. There was no joy in it, only duty. Drying brought its own trials. Lines were strung across courtyards or near hearths. In warm months, rain could undo hours of work. In cold, the damp cloth stiffened before it dried. I remember cloaks frozen mid-air, creaking like sails in the wind. Fires helped little. Smoke stained what the washing had barely cleaned. And there was always too much to do. Too few hours. Too many stains that would never come out. Soap was scarce, handmade from tallow and lye, rough on both cloth and hand. It stung the eyes, cracked the skin. The women who used it bore red knuckles and weathered palms. Some wrapped rags around their fingers, but most simply endured. Their strength was quiet, unnoticed, the strength of those who laboured in the margins, but whose work touched every body and every bed. Lords rarely thought of laundry. Their garments appeared clean when needed and vanished when soiled. But I have sat with the women who made that miracle happen, heard their jokes, their prayers, their soft curses at stubborn stains. They spoke little of hardship. Their pride was not in praise, but in results: a white collar, a fresh tunic, a bed that did not reek of weeks past. So, laundry was no chore. It was a war, against dirt, against weather, against time itself. It was a reminder that in a world of stone and steel, it was water, fire, and the will of tired hands that kept life bearable. And though the lords may never have noticed, I did. For I knew what it meant to sweat in armour and then feel the weight of a clean linen shirt, soft, warm, and rare as peace. In the castle, nothing was quick, not by choice, but by the nature of the age. Every task, from the smallest to the grandest, demanded patience and toil. There were no machines to ease the burden, no shortcuts to save an hour. Time moved slowly, measured not by bells or clocks, but by the light through arrow slits, the drip of water, the ache in your back. I came to know the rhythm of labor as well as I knew the rhythm of war. Preparing a single meal could consume half the day. Grain had to be ground by hand with a quern. 2 heavy stones, turned again and again, just to make enough flour for bread. Water had to be fetched in buckets, fires built from cold embers, pots scrubbed with sand and straw before anything could begin. I have watched 3 people labor for hours to prepare food that disappeared in minutes. Even dressing took time. Armor was not slipped on. It was fastened piece by another's hands. A knight could not don his mail alone. The same was true for noble garments. Layers of linen, wool, and fur, all tied, pinned, or laced. I once waited an hour for a lady to prepare herself for chapel. And yet, no one called it delay. It was simply the way of things. Letters were written slowly, each word inked by hand with care. A quill had to be cut properly, ink mixed, parchment stretched and dried. Then came the wax, the seal, the rider. A single message might take days to craft and weeks to deliver. I remember sending word to a neighboring lord and not knowing for 2 fortnights if he had even received it. We lived with uncertainty, as one lives with weather, constantly and without complaint. Cleaning armor was a chore in itself. After battle, or even a ride in the rain, every link, plate, and rivet had to be wiped, dried, and oiled by hand to prevent rust. Squires worked for hours bent over basins, their fingers blackened with grease. A knight who neglected his gear paid the price in battle. I learned that lesson early and never forgot it. Even leisure had its labors. Setting up a chessboard meant carving it first. Music required hours of tuning or repairing a broken string. A candle took a day to make. Tallow rendered, wicks twisted, the wax poured and cooled. I once helped dip candles for a feast, a day of repetition for just enough light to carry us through a single evening. Construction was a matter of seasons, not days. A wall might take a year, a tower 3. There was no mortar mixer, no crane, only hands, pulleys, and muscle. I watched men age while building the gatehouse, their backs bending as the stone rose above them, and when it was done, they moved on to the next wall. There was always another wall. So life in the castle was not slow by laziness, but by necessity. Every movement had weight. Every task demanded time. And in that slowness, there was a strange kind of peace. A man who labors by hand feels the day differently. He sees its length, its change, its cost. And though the work was endless, we found meaning in its rhythm. We did not rush. We endured. And in enduring, we lived. When illness came to the castle, we turned not to healing, but to hope. Medicine, as you know it, was not ours to use. We had herbs, prayers, leeches, and steel, crude tools guided by guesswork and faith. I have seen men bleed to death while being cured, and children survive fever by sheer will alone. We did what we could, and what we knew, but most often, we simply waited, for recovery or for silence. The barber surgeon was a familiar figure, apron stained, hands steady, blade always near. He cut hair, pulled teeth, lanced boils, and opened veins. Bloodletting was the answer to many ailments: fever, swelling, bad dreams. A basin, a blade, a prayer. That was the prescription. I recall lying still, teeth clenched, as the blood ran warm down my arm, believing that weakness was leaving me. Instead, it often took strength I could not spare. Leeches were used too, placed behind ears or on the belly. They drew blood slowly, and we believed they drew illness with it. I hated the feel of them, slick, silent, relentless. But I bore them, as did many others. To refuse treatment was to invite blame, should death come. Better to suffer the leech than be thought defiant of God's order. Herbal remedies were gentler but uncertain. Sage, lavender, rosemary, gathered by hand, dried in the sun, brewed into bitter teas or crushed into poultices. Wise women knew their law well, but their work was often mistrusted. I knew one who cured a soldier's infected wound with honey and thyme, only to be accused of sorcery when he recovered too quickly. Fear walks close beside ignorance. Surgery was a last resort, and a terrifying one. There was no anesthesia, only ale, biting leather, and luck. A limb removed might save a life, but more often, it hastened death. Infection followed blades as faithfully as shadows. I once held down a man while his leg was taken after a crushing injury. He screamed, then fainted, and died 2 days later. The wound festered despite our care, and we buried him with prayers and guilt. Midwives brought life into the world, but often carried death with them. Childbirth was perilous. A breach, a fever, a bleed, and there was little we could do. I have seen noble women cry not from pain, but from knowing what it might mean. Saints were invoked, relics placed under pillows, holy water sprinkled over swollen bellies. And still, the chamber sometimes fell silent after the final cry. Plague was worst of all. No cure, no pattern, no mercy. We burned herbs, rang bells, painted crosses on the doors. The sick were isolated or abandoned, depending on fear. I remember the stench, the black boils, the way the healthy fled from their own kin. Priests did their best, but even they wept behind their prayers. No poultice could stop what came for us then. So medicine in the castle was not a science, it was a gamble. A blade, a brew, a blessing. We gave what we had and bore what we must. And though many died, some lived. Perhaps it was luck, perhaps faith, or perhaps the human body, despite all, has a will that even ignorance cannot always conquer. But I know this: when healing came, it was not taken for granted. It was a miracle, every single time. Life in a castle was as much about knowing your place as it was about surviving cold or hunger. Every person, from the lowliest servant to the Lord himself, moved within a strict order, an invisible scaffolding that held the structure of power. I learned early that words could wound more than weapons if spoken at the wrong moment, to the wrong person, in the wrong tone. One misstep in etiquette could stain a reputation for life. Titles mattered. A man did not address a baron as he would a knight, nor a steward as he would a cook. I recall a page once greeting a visiting noble without the proper bow. The silence that followed was colder than the stone beneath our feet. That boy was beaten later, not cruelly, but as a lesson. Respect was not simply taught, it was enforced. Where you sat at the table spoke volumes. The head was for the lord, his kin, and honoured guests. The further you sat from the hearth, the lower your standing. I have eaten with one foot in the corridor during my early days, grateful for a bowl of stew and a place among the guard. Later, I sat closer to the dais, not through privilege, but through proving myself. It took years. Clothing, too, was speech. The cut of your cloak, the colour of your sleeves, even the weight of your belt, all signalled your rank. A noble's tunic might have silver thread, a servant's rough wool. You did not wear velvet if you had not earned it, lest whispers follow you down the corridor. I've seen men mocked for a clasp too fine, a ring too bold, a colour too rare. Speech was measured. One did not speak unless spoken to. Interrupting a superior was dangerous. Flattery was expected, honesty less so. I learned to listen more than I spoke, to read eyes and weigh silences. A misplaced word at a feast could lead to exile or worse. I saw a steward dismissed for implying that a neighbouring baron's wine was thin. He meant it as jest. It was not received that way. The church had its own layers of reverence, bishops above priests, monks above lay brothers. Even among piety, one bowed according to the cloth. Confession was given with humility, never familiarity. A chaplain once refused to bless a knight who failed to kneel properly. The knight obeyed, but his pride was clearly wounded more than if he'd been struck. And always, there were the unspoken rules: when to rise, when to sit, how to enter a room, how to receive a letter, how to pour wine without insult. A servant could live 10 years in a castle and still fear error. I remember once standing too close to a lady of rank. She said nothing, but the glance she gave me burned hotter than a forge. So yes, life within the castle walls required more than strength. It demanded awareness of place, of posture, of protocol. To survive was not enough. One had to belong. And to belong meant knowing how to navigate the narrow path of respect. It was a dance, silent and constant. And those who forgot the steps quickly found themselves without a place on the floor. No element was more vital or more feared within the castle than fire. It warmed our bones in the deep of winter, baked our bread, and boiled the water we dared not drink cold. And yet, for all its comfort, fire carried with it the constant threat of destruction. I have watched flames dance gently in the hearth and seen them leap, wild and ravenous, from a single overturned torch to devour all that stood in their path. Every day began with fire. Servants rose before the sun to rekindle embers, coaxing them back to life with breath and prayer. The great hall's hearth took hours to stoke, and every chamber needed its own flame to chase the night's chill. Smoke hung in the rafters, settling in cloth and hair. My cloak always smelled faintly of ash, a mark we all carried. It meant warmth, but also vigilance. Kitchens were the heart of heat and hazard. Flames roared beneath iron pots, fat sizzled on the hearthstone, and sparks flew freely. I have seen cooks with singed eyebrows, maids with blistered hands, and once, a boy whose tunic caught fire as he reached too far. He survived, but the memory stayed with him, and with all of us who heard his scream echo down the stone corridors. Candles and torches lit our way, but left danger in every flickering shadow. They dripped wax on wooden beams, were knocked over by careless elbows or startled dogs. One careless moment could mean disaster. I recall a guest who set his bedclothes alight with a candle left too near. He lived, but the chamber did not. For weeks, we smelled scorched linen and soot in the upper wing. Watchmen were tasked not only with guarding gates, but with guarding flame. At night, they checked each sconce and hearth, doused stray embers, and scolded servants who let fires burn too high. Fire was not left to chance. Buckets were kept filled, sand close at hand, and yet, for all our care, accidents came. Fire had no master, only those who hoped to please it. Even celebration held danger. On feast days, when the torches burned brighter and the hall blazed with light, the air grew thick and anxious. Joy was tempered by caution. One Yule, a garland caught fire during a dance. Laughter turned to panic in an instant. We smothered it with cloaks, stamped it underfoot, but the scent of burnt pine lingered through the night. A reminder that warmth is never without cost. Still, we needed fire. Without it, we could not cook, could not survive the frost, could not see to write or read or pray. It was a gift, yes, but one we held with trembling hands. I came to see it not as friend or foe, but as a wild beast kept in our midst. Beautiful, essential, and always on the edge of turning. So when I remember the castle, I think first of fire, not banners or bells, but the glow that lit our faces and the fear that flickered behind our eyes. For in fire we placed our trust, and from it we drew our breath. But we never turned our backs on it, not for a moment. Within the castle, faith was not a private matter. It was law, rhythm, and ever-present weight. The church shaped each day from dawn to dusk, from birth to burial. Bells marked the hours for prayer, meals followed the liturgical calendar, and the presence of clergy was as expected as the presence of guards. I have knelt on cold stone floors more times than I can count, reciting words I did not always understand, yet dared not ignore. Every hall had its chapel, every lord his chaplain. These men in robes held quiet authority. They heard confessions, delivered sermons, blessed meals, and whispered counsel into noble ears. A chaplain's approval could shape a marriage, a will, or a war. I once watched a powerful lord pause before executing a thief, not to consider mercy, but to wait for the priest's nod. The sentence was carried out moments later. Heresy was not merely frowned upon, it was feared. Questioning doctrine, owning forbidden texts, or even interpreting scripture without permission could lead to imprisonment or death. I remember a servant girl who murmured that saints were just old stories. She vanished the next day, taken by a monk from the abbey. We never saw her again. Silence replaced her name in conversation, as if to speak it might summon the same fate. Holy days dictated the pace of life. Work was forbidden on feast days, marriages avoided during Lent, and meat withheld during Fridays. Even the planting and harvesting of crops bowed to the church's calendar. I've seen entire feasts cancelled when a bishop arrived unexpectedly, declaring a day of fasting. The lords grumbled, the cooks wept, but no one disobeyed. Tithes were taken, even from the poorest. 1/10 of harvest, coin, or goods, paid not to the Lord, but to the church. Refusal meant excommunication, a fate more feared than exile. To be cut off from Mass, from burial rites, from the sacraments, it was to be condemned in both life and death. I have seen strong men tremble at the word, and I have seen them weep with joy when forgiven. Superstition walked hand in hand with faith. Relics were prized, a saint's bone, a splinter of the true cross, a vial of holy oil. Pilgrims travelled weeks to touch such objects. I once guarded a procession carrying a jewelled reliquary, the people kneeling in the mud as we passed. Some believed a mere glance could heal them. Others feared that doubt alone could doom them. Women, especially, were watched closely. Their piety was judged with greater scrutiny. A lady who missed Mass, who bled outside the rhythm expected, who whispered to midwives, she was vulnerable to accusation. I remember one noblewoman who was branded unnatural for spending too much time in solitude. Her prayers were questioned. Her reputation suffered, all because she chose silence over gossip. So the church was not merely a guide, it was the foundation and the ceiling. It shaped what we did, what we feared, and what we hoped for. And though it offered comfort, in ritual, in forgiveness, in the promise of heaven, it also held a heavy hand. In the castle, to live rightly meant to live obediently, and to step beyond that line, even in thought, was to risk everything, not just your life, but your soul. There were no idle lords within a castle, not truly. Nobility brought status, yes, but it also brought unending responsibility. A nobleman's time was not his own. From the first light of morning to the final prayer at dusk, he was required to judge, manage, negotiate, and protect. I learned this not from books, but from experience. Watching tired eyes behind jeweled rings, hands more calloused from parchment than from sword. The day often began with counsel. Disputes among tenants, reports from stewards, messages from neighbouring lords. Each demanded attention. A missing sheep could stir unrest. A poorly kept road could delay grain deliveries. Every matter, no matter how small, climbed the stairs to the Lord's ears. I once saw a knight delay his own wedding to settle a quarrel over inheritance. Duty waited for no feast. Noblewomen bore their own weight. They oversaw the household, every servant, every meal, every chamber. They organised storerooms, managed linens, ensured the smooth operation of the entire domestic sphere. It was not soft work. I have seen ladies with ink-stained fingers, heads bowed over ledgers, speaking sternly to wayward maids or careless cooks. Their world was vast and held together by a strength often overlooked. There were always guests to entertain. Diplomacy was not forged only in war, but over meals and conversation. Hosting required precision. Who sat where, what was served, which songs were played. A single misstep, a forgotten toast, a misplaced guest could insult an ally or empower a rival. I recall evenings where the hall glowed with laughter and wine, yet behind the smiles, tension knotted every shoulder. Military readiness was a constant concern. The armory had to be inspected, guards drilled, horses trained. Nobles were expected to lead, not merely order. I rode at dawn more times than I can count, inspecting the outer walls or testing a new recruit's skill. There were no days off from vigilance. Peace was fragile, and every season carried rumors of raids, rebellion, or border disputes. A noble who slept too soundly invited disaster. Even religion claimed its share of the day. Nobles were patrons of abbeys, sponsors of chapels, and expected to attend mass regularly. They funded altars, negotiated with bishops, and confessed with as much care as they kept ledgers. I once witnessed a lord delay sending troops until he had fasted and prayed for divine guidance. His piety was respected, but it was still a decision made under pressure. And of course, there were the letters. Pages upon pages to be read, dictated, signed, sealed. Responses to vassals, agreements with merchants, permissions for marriage, requests for aid. I have seen a nobleman's scribe fall asleep mid-script, only to be woken and told to continue. Paperwork was not a modern burden. It was born in castles and carried by those who bore titles with ink as much as with blood. So understand this. Nobility was not leisure. It was labor of a different kind, constant, unrelenting, and public. The reward was not rest, but influence, and that influence came with cost. I have known many lords who longed for a single day without summons, without judgment, without weight, but the castle never slept, and neither, truly, did those who ruled within its walls. When people speak of castles now, they imagine grandeur, soaring towers, velvet drapes, noble feasts, and the soft glow of candlelight on polished stone. They see fairy tales, not foundations. But I lived those walls. I walked their chill corridors, slept on straw, listened to the echoes of weeping in the night. A castle was not a dream. It was a fortress, cold, strict, unforgiving, and life within it demanded strength, not fantasy. The stone that looked so noble from afar was, up close, damp and unyielding. Walls sweated in the rain, floors cracked your knees, and the air was always either too cold or too still. Beauty, when found, was rare and hard won. A flower growing in the cracks, a stained glass window that caught the morning light. Most of the time, you looked not at splendor, but at soot, stains, and smoke curling from a dying hearth. Feasts, often imagined with laughter and music, were infrequent and heavy with ritual. Meat was oversalted, ale warm, and guests sometimes armed beneath their cloaks. Dangers lingered even amid celebration. A misspoken toast, an insult disguised as a jest. These could lead to duels or vengeance days later. I have sat at those tables, smiling with caution, watching every face, wondering who might turn cold before the next course. Servants were not enchanted helpers, but weary souls worn thin by endless tasks. Children were not pampered, but prepared, for marriage, for battle, for obedience. Women did not twirl in gowns of silk every evening. More often, they managed stores, soothed fevers, or braced themselves against expectations that left little room for self. The quiet strength I saw in them was not romantic. It was survival. Even love, that most romantic of notions, was a rarity, not a guarantee. Marriage was duty. Affection, if it bloomed, was a miracle. I have known secret glances across candlelit halls. Yes, But I have also known the silence of couples who shared a bed and little else. The stories told in modern times forget this, that life behind those high walls was not a waltz, but a march, steady, often harsh, and always forward. So when you see a castle and imagine luxury, remember the truth. It was a place built to endure, not to delight. Its stones were not shaped for comfort, but for survival. And those who lived within them, noble or not, bore their days with a resilience forged by cold winds, short meals, and endless duty. The castle was real, but the dream, that came centuries later. The fire has grown low now, its embers soft and glowing. The stars above still whisper, but their voices fade behind the hush of memory. You have heard much tonight, fellow traveller, not of fantasy, but of truth, worn like a cloak through the centuries. I am the lonely knight, and these memories are not stories, but echoes of what once was. If ever you walk the ruins of a castle, may you feel more than awe. May you feel the lives lived within those walls, hard, human, and deeply real.